A loom is a frame for weaving fabric. This one is made from cardboard and is 6 inches by 6 inches. Warping prepares the loom to weave. Place the thread in the first notch on either the right or left side of your loom. Make sure to leave about 3 or 4 inches of that thread, so that way it's just easier to work with whenever you get to the end, and secure that with masking tape. Make sure that the strand on the front goes in the notch directly across as you warp. The strands should go all the way across the front, but on the back they move 1 notch to the side, not across the back, which is important for removing the fabric from the loom at the end. Because cardboard looms are flimsy, take care to pull the thread down perpendicular to the notch, as if you were flossing your teeth. On the back side, holding a bend in the thread until it's at the bottom of the notch can be helpful to keep from damaging the cardboard. This way you can use each cardboard loom more times before it heads to the recycling bin. It's good to have the warp strands taut, but not pulled so tightly that it is hard to weave through them. You also don't want it loose because then it will weaken and distort the fabric. I'm using a thread that is much thinner than the yarn I will weave with, so the warp threads don't show, which creates a checkerboard effect. This way the yarn will easily cover the warp threads completely. Warp threads run vertically, top to bottom, in fabric. Weft threads run horizontally from side to side. An easy way to remember this is that the horizontal threads run right to weft. I love a bad pun. Continue warping your loom, making sure that on the front the thread goes all the way across, and on the back it just goes 1 notch to the side. For this piece, you should have 22 warp strands. Count the number of strands before you cut the thread and tape the second end on the back. If you have the correct number, both ends should be taped on the same side. I keep the taped ends at the top of my loom to make things easier when removing the fabric at the end. Plain weave is the most simple technique, weaving the weft strand 1 under, 1 over all the way across. Really, it can start with either over or under, but here I started under. I have a length of yarn about a shoulder width long, with a long tail to prevent tangles. Before pulling my needle all the way through, I double-check the weave pattern. Taking a moment to do this saves time if I realize a mistake later. When adding a new warp strand, leave a 3 to 4 inch tail so that you can easily secure the end when you finish. Pressing the yarn down to the bottom of the loom is called tamping or beading. For the return pass, pay attention to the last warp strand. You want the weft yarn to be opposite of the end of your previous row. That row ended over, so my next row needs to start under. My return pass is under, over again. If you make a mistake, you'll most likely just undo the last row. It's annoying, but easily fixed. From now on, when I pull my yarn through, I like to keep a finger pressed on the warp yarn at the end of my previous row. This helps me to not pull the yarn too tightly, cinching the warp strands closer together. The fabric would end up bowing in the middle and wouldn't have straight edges. I try to keep a little bit extra at the end, then I can gently pull it closer as I tamp the yarn down. Weaving from one side of the loom to the other is considered a row, whether it is the initial weave or the return pass. I'm starting my piece off with 6 rows of plain weave as a foundation. You can also use a fork or wide-toothed comb to help tamp down the weft strands. Compressing these strands will help create a stronger fabric. Don't forget to place a finger at the end of your previous row to hold the weft yarn in place. That way you don't over-tighten your fabric. It'll make for a much more consistent piece in the end. Raya knots can create fringe or a fuzzy texture depending on how long you make them. Just eyeball the length that you want your fringe to be, double that, and cut a little bit extra for the knot. Here I have about an 11-inch piece. It is always good to err on the side of a little bit longer than what you would like. You can measure the rest of your pieces against that first one that you cut, or use pieces of tape to get a fairly consistent measure without having to be super precise. Raya is worked across 2 warp threads at a time, so you'll need at least 11 per row for our 22 warp strands. Fold the first piece in half. The middle of that piece will lay on top of the first 2 warp threads. Then you pull them underneath the warp threads and out through the middle. A crochet hook can be useful, but it isn't necessary. Working closer to the top of the loom can also be helpful. Then tug gently on the knot to tighten it. For the next piece, you move over to the third and fourth warp thread. Again, the piece of yarn is placed on top of those two threads, and then each end is pulled underneath the warp thread and out through the center. And again, pull down on both sides to tighten the knot. Continue across the rest of the row, working one piece for every 2 warp strands. Make sure that you don't accidentally skip any. You should have 11 raya knots at the end of this row. The fringe is kind of thin because we only have the 1 row of knots. When you go to the next row, it'll fill in those empty gaps. On the second row, you skip the first warp strand and begin working at the second and third. This way you can fill those gaps and have a more full fringe. I'm using the same color for both rows. That way I have one thick area of a single color of fringe. If you wanted, you could alternate the rows in different colors, and that would give you alternating vertical stripes of fringe. When you get to the end of your row, ignore the very last warp thread, just like we did at the very beginning. Once you have more rows of fabric pushing down against the top of the knots, they'll also stay tighter. I'm planning to have 2 sections of different colored fringe that are cut at different angles. So here I'm using one technique of combing everything out and then laying my ruler on top of the strands so that way everything stays about the same length. Now, there is a lot of cleaning up to do after this because I wasn't able to cut everything exact and some stuff moved around. This is kind of like giving the weaving a haircut and just trying to get it as neat and tidy as I can, but knowing that it's probably not going to be perfect. The next 2 rows are worked exactly like the previous 2. The only difference is that I'm changing to this light gray colored yarn so that way I can have 2 different sections of fringe in different colors. The first row starts with the first 2 warp strands and is worked across every 2 warp strands until the end of the row. The second row skips the first warp strand, moving on after that, and then at the end you have 1 warp strand left over again. I carefully flipped the bottom fringe section underneath the loom so that I wouldn't accidentally cut it. Then I flipped the top fringe section down and combed it out neatly. I also gently pulled the strands down a little so that way the knots would be a bit tighter. For this top layer, I wanted the fringe to angle towards the center and point downwards. The best way to make sure that the sides are even and that I get clean cuts is to use masking tape. I positioned the tape so that I would cut along the top edge. This way I didn't have to worry about peeling the tape off of my piece afterwards. Once the tape is where I wanted it, I was able to turn the piece so that I could cut at a more comfortable angle because the masking tape was holding everything in place. Try to cut as close to the tape as you can so that you get a very good clean edge. When you're finished, you're still going to need to fix any uneven spots and do a little bit of trim here and there. So comb everything out, make sure that it's laying exactly how you want it to, and be very careful when you make these cuts. You can try different fringe shapes and lengths to see what look you like the best. I picked up the needle that still had the yarn on it from the first 6 rows of plain weave, and I'm just going above the raya knots to reset my warps to plain weave again. It's really nice to just have a good neutral base to work off of, especially between certain weaving techniques. So between each of these techniques that we're learning for this demo, you'll have at least a few rows of plain weave between each of those. For this one, we're just going to do 4 rows there and back. Remember that the plain weave rows can start either over the warp thread or under, doesn't really matter, just so that you alternate every warp thread, over, under. Make sure to pay attention to what your position was at the very last warp strand when you go to a different row. If you ended under the warp strand, the next row needs to start over the warp strand, or the other way around. Also remember that it's a good idea to hold a finger down at the end of the previous row when you go to pull through for the current row. That way you won't over tighten the weft threads and distort your fabric. For the basket weave, I changed to a different color with my second needle. Basket weave starts over 2 warp threads, under 2 warp threads, and then you repeat that for the rest of the row. So instead of going over and under each individual warp thread, you are doing that 2 at a time. Don't forget, whenever you add a new piece, that you should leave a 3 to 4 inch tail at the end, so that way you can have that to weave in when you're finished. The last 2 of my first row are 2 over, so that means the first 2 of the next row need to be 2 under. It still will alternate the same as the plain weave, but again, instead of going over 1, under 1, you're going over 2, under 2. But really, it's the same concept. The only difference here, once you get a few rows in, is that you'll notice instead of having a very, very tight weave, it'll be a little bit looser and have slightly wider sections that look like a basket, which is where the name of this technique comes from. Repeat the rows of basket weave until you have 8 rows total. Make sure that after each row you tamp the yarn down very well. You want a nice compressed fabric so that it'll be stronger. You may also notice that I'm using the fork not to just tamp down my fabric, but also to lift some of the warp strands to make it easier to pass my needle through. So definitely use these tools in more than one way if that can be helpful. To get the white yarn up to the next section, I used the needle that the white yarn is on and put it up through where the warp threads are between the weft weaving that I've done to make sure that it won't show, and I'll be able to use it right at the end of where that basket weave is. It's actually better to get your yarn to travel up at the end of each row when you come back to that side, but I had forgotten to do that. On the side with the yarn that you're trying to move up, when you get to the end, when you have the bend in your yarn before you pull that row tighter, you want to move that traveling yarn up through the loop. Then when you tighten it, it'll be trapped and ready for you at the next row. Finish up your 4 rows of plain weave and we'll move on to the next technique. Loop weave creates a physical texture that comes out from the surface of your weaving. You're going to start with a plain weave row and wrap that around a dowel to create your loops. This can also be done with a pencil, and depending on the size of your dowel, you'll have bigger or smaller loops. I changed back to my gray yarn, but I still need to pay attention to how my last row ended. That one ended on under, so the beginning of this next row should start over, so that way it'll be consistent throughout the fabric. So I would start over, under, and go all the way across in a plain weave, and then I can start looping over my dowel. Start with your dowel or pencil on the right side where you started your weaving, and that way you're able to insert your pencil, and every time the yarn goes over a warp, you're going to pick that up, slide the pencil underneath, and then move on to the next one. Pay attention to which direction you are wrapping around the pencil or dowel. Try to have it consistent each time. For mine, when I pull up the yarn, I'm taking it from underneath the pencil and over the top before I move on to the next warp. It's okay if this is a little bit loose right now, because once you have all of the loops on your pencil, then we're going to go across and tighten them a little bit before you do the return pass. Starting at the right side where you began your plain weave and moving towards the end of that row, gently tug on each of the loops so that way they can be as consistent as possible. Before you take the pencil out, it's best to do the row going the opposite direction in plain weave first. That way you're less likely to pull the loops accidentally and make them uneven. The end of my loop row finished under, so this row of plain weave needs to start over. Once you pull that all the way through, beat that row down on top of the loop roll and very gently remove the pencil. Then you still want to be careful and with even pressure, press down on both of those rows to flatten out the loops. To alternate the loops so that they fill the space better, do one row of plain weave across, and then we'll do the loop row on the way back. Going from left to right, my last row ended under, so this time I'll start over. I'm making my plain weave fairly loose here, so that way it will be easier when I go to pull the loops up to wrap around the pencil. Just like last time, every time the yarn goes over a warp thread, that is where I'll pull up and wrap it around the pencil. I'm also going the same direction across the pencil every time. Tug gently from one end to the other at each loop to keep them the same size. Do the next row of plain weave before you pull the pencil out, and once that's beat down right at the pencil line, then you can gently remove the pencil and beat down both rows at the same time. Again, to have the loops alternating so that it fills the space better visually, you need to do a return pass in plain weave and then begin your pattern over again with your loop and then plain weave. You can do this as many times as you would need. In this one, I did 3 rows of loop weave, and then my very last row of plain weave that holds those loops in place was white because that mirrored what happened at the beginning of my pattern. To secure the gray yarn, I wrapped it around the last warp thread and then down along the warp thread between the woven yarn and out the back. Do 3 more rows of plain weave to reset your warp and get ready for the next.